Well, it's time for Biz Chat Weekly, what we've been waiting for. I'm joined by Ken Gishinga, CEO of Menteri Economics, and Wahorondo, who is a former DG Public Debt at Treasury, to help us put into perspective the top stories across this week. We start with matters to do with SOEs and parastatals, where 18 state-owned parastatals and corporations have been earmarked by the IMF, and this is over inconsistent financial performance as targets for disbandment. And actually looking at this cumulatively, these SOEs have a liquidity gap of 382 billion shillings, and these over the next 5 years. Ken, I mean, these we saw way back when we were talking matters debt and us borrowing more, we will be backed in a corner. How should we prepare for what is coming ahead of us? All right. Ken Gishinga actually right there, almost gaining. But let me bring in Mr. Ndoho. Looking at this, you know, it brings back memories of what happened in the 90s, and they're not sweet memories. These are bitter memories. In this particular situation, what are we foreseeing in regards to restructuring the state-owned enterprises?
Well, we've had a long journey to this, and it was inevitable at some point we would have to look at the way we run our budget. And the reality is, if a government sets up a profit-making business, it has to make profit. If it's not making profit, then you have a problem, because it means they have to dip back into our budget, which you and I pay taxes, to keep it afloat. And I think this conversation is as old as Kenya is. I think I'll basically point everyone back to the session of paper number 10, 1965, where basically parastatals were set up for the Africanization of our economy. We're well past that. So the hard question now is, how do you make business make sense? Basically, government has no business being in business. And I think this conversation has it's gone around this mulberry bush for a long time. And it's about time, I think, we really did have a hard conversation about what's the way forward.
And that's actually key pointers that you're raising right there. Ken Gishinga, I mean, this has been coming for a long time, as Mr. Ndoho puts it. Is this a reoccurrence of what happened in the 90s? And was that not precedence enough for us to relook at how government does its business?
Well, it is a recurrence, and it's a bit sad that we don't seem to learn from economic history. I think if you look at some of the proposed measures on cutting back on civil servants, I think this will have significant impact on the society, not least because one employed person there's a huge dependency ratio in this part of the country. So I think it's something that we need to think about more thoroughly moving forward.
Very, very important. And looking at some of these state-owned corporations, we have KBC, Postal Corporation of Kenya, East African Portland Cement, and Post Bank, and these are loss-making. Then we have also the likes of Kenya Pipeline, were found to be highly profitable, while the rest are operating below cost recovery. So, Mr. Ndoho, maybe looking at the way these SOEs are performing, some of them are making good money. Look at KenGen performing very well, Kenya Pipeline doing very well, but the likes of Kenya Postal Corporation, I mean, what will it take to revolutionize these businesses, and what is the way forward? Is it merging? Is it folding some of these businesses up? What options do we have as a country?
Well, unfortunately, we live in a world where it's very dynamic. You'll notice that the ones that make good money are all monopolies. And they're monopolies in an environment where there's not evolved an alternative competitor. But the ones that are doing badly have found equivalent private sector competitors. And so this is a conversation economists have all the time. How do you make sure that as a government, you're there just to create an enabling environment and allow the private sector to basically participate. Because eventually, if you have to choose between a private sector player and a public sector player, it's hands down the private sector player that will do very well. So Posta and have been overtaken by Safaricom, they've been overtaken by Jumia and a lot of other technology companies. And so in this conversation, I think this is a conversation we absolutely have to have. It cannot be that we continue this back and forth, holding on to industries for which right now we cannot, not only does it cost us money, but it also creates a dragging effect, because also a lot of these companies or corporations also are involved in regulation. And so they have a sense in which they hold back the private sector from getting on with it. And so I think, to me, I think it's time we had this conversation. We really should. And I know, unfortunately, I know everyone will throw stones at the IMF, but I keep saying no. Ask yourself, at this point in the history and as an economy, should we really be having a lot of these organizations? And if not, should we just free it up and let the average Kenyan out there get into the market, make, especially the young people in the SMEs, make an impact, creating an alternative?
And that is very interesting point. You've mentioned that the successful ones are monopolies. Ken, I mean, looking at competition, can government just come into the market and be competitive? I mean, it's government, it has a backing of resources. Why can't it compete with the private sector, especially these that are loss-making? Like, for example, Postal Corporation of Kenya, I see they're embracing digitization. These days with the traditional, the way they used to run business, that has really changed. So can government, just compete with the private sector on a fair and level ground?
Absolutely, there is a space for government. I'm not in the school of thought that advocates for extreme privatization. I've always said we need to apply the principle of subsidiarity, which states that what the smaller body can do, let not the bigger body do. So if the private sector can do it efficiently, yes, absolutely, there is no need to have the government come into it. But there are some areas where, out of things such as national security, you still want to have government involvement. If you look at countries like in the US, the Postal Service is a very vibrant service. We go to France too. So there's still a place for government to play, but I think we need to start having that, applying that principle of subsidiarity to see what are the things that can be done at the smallest level and what are the things that maybe out of national security need only to be done by government.
Important. And you've mentioned the US there. That brings us to the next topic of discussion, and this in regards to Kenya-US free trade deal that we brokered during the Trump era. And actually, there's sort of a shifting in ground, if we may put it so. And there are quite a number of changes that we've seen. Let me just get that here. There is this element called the Trade Promotion Authority, which delegates power to the U.S. head of state to fast-track trade negotiations with the Congress. And this particular had the deadline of July 1st, which President Biden allowed to pass. Now, these negotiations between Kenya and the U.S. will have to be scrutinized by this, by this regime, by the United States Congress. I mean, Mr. Ndoho, maybe help us understand the dynamics briefly, because we don't have much time. The dynamics when we have regime change, does that always have to come with a change in how we make business deals between these, big boys, so to call, in the global scale of things?
No, which is very interesting. That's an excellent question. And the reality is, what you should always look for the underlying base. And what is really interesting about the Biden administration is that it's a trade chief, I think her name is Tai. She's basically said, she let the TPA expire because she said, we want to make sure that whatever deal, even one that goes through Congress, must be one that favors the US companies first, which ironically is exactly what Trump was saying, as America first. So there's an America first doctrine, which very conveniently the Biden administration has let to expire. And so I think for us, the question to ask is, with the AGOA negotiations coming, the thing that we'll all look out for is the fact that the Trump doctrine of America first continues, even though the administration has changed.
And Ken, as we close up, I mean, AGOA is coming to an end in the next, it's closing up in 2025, I believe, and we have to rethink. How best can we position ourselves in terms of trade between Kenya and the US right now as you speak?
Well, first of all, now you have to understand the philosophies that apply in the US, where you have the Republicans that are very much for bilateral trade, and Democrats tend to be much more towards multilateral trade. So obviously under Trump, he really pushed on bilateral trade, and we saw that coming up. Obviously Biden will be looking at more of multilateral trade with the African Continental Free Trade. So for me, I think it's what was said is pretty much pouring cold water on the future of bilateral trade, because it's not within the Democrats' principles. However, in the UK, you still have the Conservatives who are on the right wing still pushing for bilateral trade with Kenya. So I think for Kenya, it's going to be, I think it's a lost, I think for me, I think it's almost a lost cause. I think there'll be much